Hey viewers! Hope you're all doing great. Before I start the story, tell me in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you enjoy my videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. The medieval hospital that was centuries ahead of Europe. The centuries. The air is thick with the scent of spice and ink, parchment and jasmine. You are standing in Baghdad sometime around the 9th century, when the world was young in knowledge and wisdom was treasured like gold. The streets hum with scholars in flowing robes, traders with baskets of dates and figs, the murmur of poets under the shade of orange trees. And somewhere beyond this bustling cityscape, a great building rises, white stone walls glinting in the sun, tall wooden doors inscribed with Arabic calligraphy. Above the gate, the word bimaristan, the house of the sick. It was not just a hospital. It was a university, a sanctuary, a laboratory, and a refuge for those broken in body or mind. In this place, centuries before Europe's first universities or public hospitals, medicine was a science, not superstition. Here, doctors followed the teachings of Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. Here, the pulse of reason beat louder than fear. The story begins in the Abbasid Caliphate, a golden age that made Baghdad the center of the world's knowledge. When Caliph Harun al-Rashid ruled, the city glittered like a jewel on the Tigris. Under his reign, scholars were not only welcomed, they were funded. The Caliph's son, Al-Mamun, founded the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, a vast library and translation center that gathered Greek, Persian, and Indian medical works under one roof. From this intellectual furnace, a new vision of healthcare was born. The idea was revolutionary. That illness was not a punishment from God, but a natural imbalance that could be observed, studied, and healed. That mental illness was not possession, but a condition of the mind needing compassion and treatment. That medicine must serve all people, rich or poor, man or woman, Muslim or Christian or Jew. The first great bimaristan of Baghdad was built under Harun al-Rashid, around the year 805 CE. It was inspired by earlier Persian hospitals, especially the one in Jundashapur, a center of science in pre-Islamic Iran, but the Abbasids made it something greater. This new hospital had separate wards for different diseases, a concept unheard of in Europe for hundreds of years to come. There were isolation rooms for contagious patients, baths for therapy, and libraries where doctors studied by lamplight. There were fountains to cool the air, and gardens to soothe the spirit. Even the architecture itself was healing. Patients were greeted with kindness. They were given clean clothes, nutritious food, and fresh bedding. Doctors made daily rounds, keeping detailed records of every patient, the beginnings of clinical case notes. And when the patients recovered, they received money and clothes so they could return to life with dignity. It was medicine guided not only by science but by ethics. In Europe of the same era, most of the sick were tended in monasteries. There, treatments were prayers, charms, and bleeding by leeches. Illness was often seen as divine punishment. Surgery was crude, cleanliness unknown. But in Baghdad's bimaristans, water flowed freely, for the city's engineers had built vast aqueducts and fountains. Doctors washed their hands before touching a patient, 8 centuries before Europe adopted such hygiene. They used antiseptics like alcohol and rose water. They treated fevers with cool compresses, burns with balms of camphor and honey, and infections with vinegar and herbs. Every step had purpose. Every method had reason. Among the great physicians who walked those marble halls was Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes. He was a man of restless curiosity, a scientist who rejected blind tradition. Appointed head of the Baghdad hospital, he insisted on empirical observation, on testing and proving every treatment. It was Al-Razi who distinguished smallpox from measles, a breakthrough that saved countless lives. It was he who said, "The duty of the physician is not only to cure, but to prevent disease." He even wrote a manual for hospital management, describing the layout of wards, the duties of staff, and the ethical treatment of patients, perhaps the first medical administration text in history. When a new hospital was to be built, Legend says Al-Razi hung pieces of meat around the city. Where the meat decayed slowest, he chose the site, for it had the cleanest, healthiest air. This was public health before the term even existed. Inside the bimaristan, the students walked the corridors beside their teachers, learning from real patients. They asked questions, made notes, and debated symptoms. They studied anatomy, pharmacology, surgery, and psychology. They learned that sight, smell, and sound were tools of diagnosis, that the pulse, the urine, the tongue all spoke in secret languages of the body. And when a case puzzled them, they went to the library, where hundreds of manuscripts lined the shelves. Translations from Greek, Sanskrit, and Syriac, alongside the writings of Muslim scholars themselves. In these places, science was not feared. It was faith's companion. The Quran had told them, "He who saves one life, it is as if he saved all mankind." And so they healed, with heart and hand united. As the night falls over ancient Baghdad, the lamps of the bimaristan glow like constellations. Inside, the faint sound of water murmurs in marble basins. A physician whispers verses of comfort to an old man with fever. A nurse adjusts the pillows of a child recovering from infection. And above them all, knowledge, precious and fragile, burns bright against the dark. This was the dawn of medical science as we know it. And Baghdad, in its golden age, was centuries ahead of the world. Let your mind walk slowly now, through the wide avenues of old Baghdad. The morning sun glints off the domes of mosques and libraries, the scent of baked bread mingles with rose water, and from the east, the cool breeze of the Tigris River drifts in. Ahead of you, the great gate of the bimaristan al-Rashidi opens, carved in geometric patterns, crowned with verses reminding all who enter that healing is both science and mercy. Inside, silence and order reign. The air is cool, scented faintly with herbs, myrrh, camphor, saffron, frankincense. The corridors stretch long and straight, lined with polished tiles and illuminated by narrow shafts of sunlight. Soft footsteps echo on the stone floors. A faint sound of water flows from inner courtyards, fountains meant not only for decoration, but for therapy. In the heart of the bimaristan, the wards open like petals of a flower. Each section is devoted to a specific ailment. The fever ward glows warm and quiet. The surgical ward is equipped with copper instruments, kept clean and sharp. There is a ward for mental health, where patients suffering from melancholy or madness are treated with gentle music, conversation, and aromatics. This too was unheard of in Europe, where the mad were still chained or exiled. Here they were patients, not prisoners. Music, the rhythmic tones of the oud and ney, was used as medicine. Water flowed constantly through marble channels to cool the air. The sound of trickling fountains was believed to soothe the nerves and purify the spirit. Patients were encouraged to walk, talk, and pray if they wished. And above all, they were respected as human beings. The staff of the bimaristan formed a disciplined system. At the head stood the chief physician, a scholar of wide reputation. Under him were the resident doctors, often students of medicine completing their studies. Then came the apothecaries, the surgeons, the nurses, the record keepers, and even inspectors whose duty was to ensure cleanliness, quality of food, and proper conduct of the staff. Each role had a written description, for order was sacred. A daily log was maintained, patient name, symptoms, treatment, and progress, a remarkable precursor to the modern medical chart. And every week, a council of physicians met to discuss complex cases. In the courtyard, beneath the shadow of orange trees, they debated diagnoses, exchanged ideas, and cited the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Al-Razi himself. This was peer review. Long before modern medicine invented the term, errors were corrected, improvements noted, and new treatments recorded. Knowledge grew like vines along the walls of reason. The pharmacy, or Saydalania, was the beating heart of the bimaristan's practice. Inside, shelves held jars of powders, tinctures, oils, and dried roots labeled in careful calligraphy. The air was a tapestry of scents: mint, cardamom, wormwood, lavender, and musk. The apothecaries were trained professionals, tested on their knowledge of botany and chemistry. Every drug was prepared according to the writings of Dioscorides and refined by Arab and Persian science. They ground poppy seeds into painkillers, mixed camphor for cooling, and brewed willow bark to reduce fever. Centuries before Europeans discovered its active ingredient as aspirin. They made ointments from sesame oil, antiseptic rinses of vinegar, and digestive tonics flavored with fennel and honey. Everything had measure. Nothing was random. The art of pharmacy was not sorcery. It was precision. Across the courtyard, the medical school buzzed with energy. Here, students sat cross-legged with their writing tablets, their eyes fixed on the master physician who lectured softly but with conviction. Sometimes, he would bring a patient before them, describing symptoms and inviting discussion. Diagnosis was a dialogue, a test of logic and memory. The students learned not just how to heal the body but how to listen. Because in the philosophy of medicine that blossomed in Baghdad, the patient's words were part of the cure. At night, the students returned to their lodgings carrying oil lamps and manuscripts. They studied the great medical texts, the Canon of Medicine by Ibn Sina, Al-Hawi by Al-Razi, and earlier works translated from Greek, Syriac, and Sanskrit. Every page linked the wisdom of civilizations, Greek logic, Indian herbal knowledge, Persian hospitals, and fused it into a single coherent science. Baghdad's bimaristans were not only for the city's elite. They were public institutions, supported by Waqf, charitable endowments. This meant that the hospital's expenses were permanently funded by donations, land revenues, and trusts, ensuring that no patient paid for care. Rich and poor shared the same beds, ate the same food, and were treated by the same doctors. In a world where status divided all things, this was a quiet revolution of compassion. Visitors were welcomed. Travelers from distant lands, from Cairo, Damascus, Cordoba, even Byzantium, came to study these hospitals. They carried back ideas that would, centuries later, inspire Europe's own medical revival. The seeds of modern healthcare were being sown here, in the dust and sunlight of Baghdad. In every bimaristan, cleanliness was a sacred duty. Floors were scrubbed daily with lime and soap. Water basins were emptied and refilled every morning. Bed linens were boiled and dried under the open sun. Physicians washed their hands and instruments before and after examining patients, practices that predated modern germ theory by nearly 1,000 years. The staff even burned aromatic resins like frankincense and sandalwood to purify the air. Everything spoke of care, not only for the sick, but for the idea of order and beauty. Because to heal the body, they believed, one must also heal the surroundings. As evening fell, the bimaristan transformed again. Torches flickered in brass holders. The courtyards glowed in amber light. From the mental health ward came the gentle strumming of the oud. Patients dined together. Bowls of lentil soup, bread, fruit, and sweet sherbet. The physicians gathered for final rounds, their robes whispering as they moved from bed to bed. The city beyond the walls quieted, but within, the pulse of healing continued, steady and calm. Baghdad slept under the stars, but its hospitals never did. The lamps burned through the night, like beacons of mercy in a dark age elsewhere. This was the rhythm of life in the bimaristan, a balance between science, compassion, and faith. And in that balance, the world found its first true glimpse of modern medicine. Let us move closer now. Beyond the whitewashed courtyards and whispering fountains, we step into the Hall of Physicians, the very mind of the Baghdad bimaristan. Here wisdom walked in human form. Men with calm eyes and ink-stained fingers bent over scrolls and patients alike, blending philosophy with pulse, logic with compassion. It was said that in Baghdad, a true physician was not merely a healer of flesh but a scholar of nature, a student of ethics, and a guardian of life. And in these echoing halls, names were written that would one day echo across the world. Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majasi, and Ibn al-Nafis. Abu Bakr al-Razi, known to the West as Razes, stands first among them. Born in Ray, near Tehran, he came to Baghdad as a young man hungry for knowledge. He studied chemistry, music, and philosophy before turning to medicine, and his curiosity never dimmed. When appointed head of the Baghdad bimaristan, he reorganized the entire system, from patient wards to record-keeping. He demanded observation, not assumption. He said, "If your experience does not match the books, follow experience, not the books." Razi's methods were startlingly modern. He performed clinical experiments, compared outcomes, and even wrote of control groups, something Europe would not rediscover for centuries. He catalogued hundreds of diseases, from smallpox to kidney stones, and described their symptoms, treatments, and prognosis in exquisite detail. He also emphasized psychological care, noting that depression or stress could worsen physical illness. He wrote that a physician must also treat the soul. At night, he composed treatises by the light of a single lamp. His greatest work, Al-Hawi, the comprehensive book on medicine, stretched across 20 volumes, gathering the knowledge of the Greeks and adding his own discoveries. For generations, it was the standard medical text of both East and West. Then came Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, a child prodigy who memorized the Quran by 10, and mastered medicine before 20. Though he lived later, his influence reached back to Baghdad like a returning tide. His canon of medicine synthesized Greek, Persian, and Arabic thought into a single system of logic and observation. He explained contagion, quarantine, and the concept that diseases could be spread through water, soil, or air. His works were studied in Baghdad's bimaristans, where doctors debated his theories under the shade of palm trees. Ibn Sina's vision of medicine was both spiritual and scientific, a harmony of body, mind, and environment. He believed that a healthy life depended on balance: diet, exercise, rest, and mental peace. And in the hospitals that bore his influence, treatment began not with a potion, but with listening. Doctors sat beside patients and spoke softly, gathering their stories like clues to a mystery. Another great name whispered through these halls was Ali ibn al-Abbas al-Majusi, known in the West as Ali Abbas. He wrote Kitab al-Maliki, the complete book of the medical art. It described human anatomy in language both precise and poetic. He was one of the first to discuss nervous disorders, distinguishing between paralysis caused by brain injury and that caused by spinal damage. His attention to the body's structure, muscles, organs, vessels, revealed an understanding centuries ahead of its time. His work was translated into Latin, taught in Salerno and Montpellier, shaping European medicine long before the Renaissance claimed discovery. But the roots of that knowledge, the pulse of that thought, had already beat here, in Baghdad's bimaristans. These hospitals were not silent. They were living academies. In the lecture halls, heated debates rose like the sound of birds at dawn. Physicians discussed the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, not as mystical forces but as early theories of chemistry and balance. They observed how fever altered the color of urine, how diet changed the pulse, how mental distress caused physical pain. Their records included sketches, case notes, and measured tables of medicines, the embryo of evidence-based medicine. When a difficult case appeared, the physician would summon his colleagues. Together they examined the patient, each offering observations before prescribing a course of treatment. It was a democracy of intellect, guided by curiosity rather than hierarchy. No decision was sacred, except the pursuit of truth. Yet medicine was not only about the learned. Many female nurses and assistants worked in the bimaristans. They were trained to change dressings, prepare food, and comfort the sick. Some even studied anatomy and pharmacology under supervision. This inclusion of women in medical service was another innovation that would not reach Europe for hundreds of years. Records from the 10th century mention bimaristan al-Munsuri in Cairo, modeled after Baghdad's hospitals, where both male and female wards existed side by side, separated but equal in care and respect. Their work was seen as noble, their compassion divine. Beyond Baghdad, the fame of these physicians spread east and west. Pilgrims carried tales of hospitals where patients were treated with dignity and precision. scholars from Byzantium and India visited, their robes dusty from the long road, to study in these institutions. They returned home with notes and manuscripts, planting the seeds of progress across continents. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, hospitals remained little more than shelters for the dying. The sick lay crowded in halls, unwashed, untreated, prayed over by monks who understood faith but not the body. To them, illness was divine punishment. To Baghdad, it was a natural condition with a natural cure. The contrast could not have been sharper. When Europe still relied on leeches, charms, and astrology, the doctors of Baghdad were measuring the pulse, recording symptoms, and testing medicines. It was not magic. It was method, calm, deliberate, and human. The bimaristans of Baghdad were not just hospitals. They were symbols of civilization itself. They stood for reason when the world beyond was lost in fear. And their physicians, humble, curious, devoted, were the torchbearers of light in a time that the West would later call dark. Their flame still flickers through time. Through every clean ward, every careful hand wash, every patient's chart and sterile tool. Because once, in the heart of ancient Baghdad, medicine became not just healing, but humanity in its purest form. It is dawn again in Baghdad, the city of light. The first rays of the sun touch the domes of the bimaristan, turning them gold. Inside, the morning begins not with noise, but with ritual precision. Physicians gather under the archways, their robes crisp, their hands washed in cool water scented with rose and camphor. Students take their places with tablets of parchment and reed pens. The air hums with quiet anticipation. A patient is brought in, a merchant with a fever. The chief physician speaks softly. Observe before you act. Listen before you prescribe. And so, the lesson begins. The medical science practiced in Baghdad's hospitals was unlike anything the medieval world had seen. It was systematic, empirical, and deeply human-centered. Every symptom was observed. Every change in the body was noted and compared to earlier cases. Doctors were required to document their work, not for glory, but for accuracy. They kept patient histories, detailing what foods were eaten, what dreams were recalled, what emotions stirred the heart. They believed the body and mind were inseparable, that sorrow could weaken the liver, anger could heat the blood, and fear could disturb the heartbeat. Thus, healing had to include both science and comfort. The concept of psychosomatic health, so modern in name, was ancient in practice here. In the mental ward, the sound of gentle music floated through latticed windows. The air was perfumed with jasmine and basil. Patients were encouraged to write, to talk, to listen to stories, all to bring peace to their minds. One of the oldest surviving Arabic medical texts records that music lifts the soul, and the soul governs the body. So the bimaristan healed both. Diagnosis was an art. Physicians used their senses like instruments, the color of the tongue, the scent of the breath, the texture of the skin. They examined the urine, comparing its color and clarity with descriptions in great medical manuals. They checked the pulse, believing its rhythm revealed the state of internal organs. Every movement, every sound, every breath meant something. Physician might say, the pulse quickens with heat and emotion. The liver governs the blood. If the blood is too thick, the body warms and fever comes. We must cool, not bleed. And so he prescribed syrups of pomegranate, infusions of willow bark, rest, hydration, and quiet, not punishment or superstition. Leeches and charms had no place here. Instead, rational observation ruled, tempered by compassion. One of the most advanced practices in Baghdad's hospitals was the study of surgery. Surgical rooms were kept spotless. Tools were boiled or washed in wine and water before use. Surgeons used antiseptics, alcohol, vinegar, and herbal distillates to clean wounds. They used cotton, not moss or rags, to dress injuries. They even employed catgut sutures, strings made from animal intestines, to stitch wounds, a technique rediscovered in Europe centuries later. Surgeons of Baghdad performed cataract removals, bone settings, trepanations, and tumor extractions with remarkable skill. They used instruments of bronze and steel, shaped with precision, scalpels, forceps, retractors, and even hollow needles for fluid drainage. The famed surgeon Al-Zarawi of Cordoba, though living in Al-Andalus, was part of this same intellectual world. His illustrated book of surgical instruments, Al-Tasrif, was studied in Baghdad's bimaristans, copied by hand, and carried by travelers east and west. In every ward, students learned by practice, not memorization alone. They shadowed senior physicians, assisting in diagnosis, recording patient progress, and observing operations. After years of apprenticeship, they underwent examinations, oral, written, and practical, before being allowed to practice independently. To become a licensed physician in Baghdad, one had to pass these tests under government supervision. This was centuries before Europe introduced formal medical licensing. The Abbasid Caliphate understood that untrained healers could cause harm. So inspectors, known as mutasibs, roamed the streets, checking apothecaries, questioning doctors, and punishing those who practiced without certification. Medicine, therefore, was both a science and a regulated profession, one that valued accountability as much as knowledge. Within the pharmaceutical wards, experimentation thrived. Doctors tested combinations of herbs, minerals, and distillates to refine treatments. They distilled rose water for cooling fevers, and camphor oil for infections. They crushed aloe leaves for wounds, mint for digestion, fennel for eyesight, and henna for inflammation. Alchemy, the precursor to chemistry, was practiced here with purpose, to extract purity, not magic. They recorded every formula with precision. Take 10 grains of coriander, 5 of cardamom, and 1 measure of vinegar. Mix and leave to settle in the shade for 3 days. It was medicine written like poetry. Measured, rhythmic, exact. The patients came from every walk of life. Merchants, soldiers, scholars, beggars. They arrived weak, frightened, and weary from travel. The gatekeeper greeted them, offered them cool water, and asked their ailment. No one was turned away. They were bathed, clothed, and examined without prejudice. The poor received treatment free of charge, supported by Waqf endowments established by wealthy patrons who sought divine reward through charity. Even mental patients who elsewhere were abandoned or feared, were given music, baths, and gardens. Their keepers were instructed to speak kindly, to treat them as souls in need of rest, not punishment. Such compassion was written into hospital codes, a legal, moral, and religious obligation. To understand the bimaristan is to see a civilization's soul. Its architecture mirrored its philosophy. Symmetry, balance, light, and water. Its medicine mirrored its faith. That knowledge was sacred, and healing was an act of worship. Doctors often began their day with prayer, not out of superstition, but out of humility, a reminder that science served life, not pride. In the golden centuries between the 8th and 12th, Baghdad's hospitals represented the pinnacle of human progress. They stood as symbols of rationality in a world of fear, of compassion in a time of cruelty, and of order in an age of chaos. And through their open doors a whisper traveled, a whisper that would, centuries later, awaken the sleeping minds of Europe. The day ends in Baghdad's bimaristan. Lamps are lit again. The scent of rose water drifts through the wards. A nurse hums quietly beside a resting patient. Outside, the muezzin calls for prayer, a sound blending faith and science into one eternal song. Because here, in this city of healing, the line between medicine and mercy was never drawn. The courtyard of the Baghdad bimaristan was alive not with the cries of the sick, but with the calm hum of care. It was a place where the air smelled faintly of boiled herbs and warm oil, where sandalwood smoke curled from clay burners to keep the air clean and pleasant. And within its stone walls moved the quiet figures of the physicians, the healers of the Golden Age. Their robes were white or pale linen, tied with simple cords. No ornaments, no gold. Only the faint rustle of parchment scrolls tucked under their arms and the jingle of small bronze instruments at their waists. They were men and women of knowledge, trained not only to cure, but to observe, to record, and to reason. At dawn, they assembled in the teaching courtyard, shaded by arches and cooled by running fountains. The chief physician, sometimes called the Res al-Tiba, would take his place upon a low wooden chair. Around him sat the younger doctors and the students, all listening intently. Patients were brought before them one by one. Their symptoms were discussed openly, diagnoses debated, and treatments prescribed, never blindly, always with logic and compassion. Imagine the murmur of Arabic phrases. The pulse is weak. The urine is clear. The fever must be from the liver. Increase the patient's rest, and mix rosewater with honey for the throat. These discussions were recorded in leather-bound journals. Each bimaristan became not only a hospital but a university, a living book of medicine constantly rewritten. Among the students were those who would one day become legends, like al-Razi, the great Persian physician who studied in Baghdad and wrote the Kitab al-Hawi, a vast encyclopedia of medical knowledge. Al-Razi was known to test new cures scientifically, comparing results before declaring any treatment effective, an idea utterly foreign to medieval Europe at the time, where illness was often blamed on demons, curses, or bad air. But here, in Baghdad's bimaristan, the cause of sickness was sought in reason. Walk down the tiled corridors of this ancient hospital in your mind. Hear the echo of sandals on marble. Feel the faint vibration of a canet, the underground channel that carried cool water into the hospital's fountains. Every ward had its own water flow, its own attendants to keep the air fresh and the bedding clean. You might pass through the ward for fevers, where patients rested on beds lined with white cotton sheets. Attendants fanned the air with woven palm leaves, keeping flies away. Bowls of pomegranate juice and barley water stood at the bedside, to cool the body and ease the stomach. Next, you'd see the ward for wounds and fractures. There, the smell of honey and vinegar lingered, for both were used as antiseptics. Splints were made from smooth tamarisk wood, bound with linen soaked in gum. The surgeons, calm and steady, wore gloves made of softened leather. They washed their hands before and after each procedure, centuries before the germ theory of disease would be discovered in Europe. And further still, there was the ward for the mentally unwell, a place of special wonder and compassion. Unlike the dark asylums of later centuries, Baghdad's physicians treated the mind as gently as the body. Patients were soothed with music, poetry, and scented baths. The belief was simple yet profound. A troubled mind could be healed through beauty, rhythm, and calm. Musicians would sit by the fountains, playing slow melodies on the oud and ney. The sound drifted through the open arches, mingling with birdsong and the murmur of water. Imagine the way that music might have softened pain, slowed the breath, eased the heart. Every bimaristan kept a library. Its shelves were lined with manuscripts on anatomy, pharmacology, surgery, and philosophy, copied in neat Kufic script by scholars and scribes. Some texts came from the Greeks, Galen, Hippocrates, Dioscorides. Others were from India and Persia, translated into Arabic so that the wisdom of many lands could merge. Baghdad's translators, working in the famous Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, sent copies of these works to the hospitals, where physicians studied them at night by the flicker of oil lamps. But they did not simply repeat what was written. They tested it. If a Greek text claimed that a fever rose from imbalance in the humors, the doctors of Baghdad observed the patients themselves. Sometimes they confirmed the old ideas. Sometimes they corrected them. Slowly, carefully, a new science took shape. One based on evidence, on record-keeping, and on the courage to question. And yes, there were women among these healers. Some were nurses, others skilled physicians in their own right. Historical accounts mention women like Banu Musa's sister, known for her expertise in treating female patients, and Zainab al-Isra'iliya, who worked as a specialist in obstetrics. They moved quietly through the wards, often veiled, often working behind curtains when attending to male patients. Yet their contribution was immense. Women managed the pharmacy stores, prepared medicinal syrups, and assisted in childbirth, all under the guidance of senior physicians. Their presence reminded the patients that healing was not merely science, but mercy. Outside the bimaristan's walls, Baghdad pulsed with life. Merchants shouted in the markets. Camels trudged across the bridges. The great Tigris shimmered beneath the sun. But within the hospital, a sacred calm endured, a rhythm of care that never ceased. Even in times of war or plague, the hospitals remained open. Endowments called waqf ensured that the poor received treatment without charge. Wealthy patrons would donate gold, land, or books to support the physicians and the sick. It was said that if you walked into a Baghdad bimaristan with nothing but pain, you would leave with food, clean clothes, and sometimes a small pouch of coins, a gift to help you recover in dignity. At night, the hospital did not sleep. The physicians on duty carried lamps of bronze or glass. Their flames reflected on whitewashed walls. They moved softly between beds, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, whispering reassurances. In the pharmacy, the Saydalani, the apothecary, ground herbs under the flicker of lanterns. Cardamom, clove, saffron, mint, aloe, camphor. The smell was intoxicating. Medicines were stored in labeled jars, their names written in both Arabic and Persian. Every dose, every mixture was recorded. It was methodical, gentle, and deeply human. And as dawn neared, the first call to prayer would rise from the city. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, echoing through the arches of the hospital. The physicians would pause, bow their heads, and whisper a prayer not only for their patients, but for the knowledge to heal. The bimaristan was more than a hospital. It was a sanctuary, for science, for faith, and for the fragile hope that mercy and reason could coexist. When the lamps of Baghdad burned through the night, the world beyond was still wrapped in a darker age. In Europe, monasteries guarded a few crumbling scrolls of Galen, while the sick lay untreated, believing their illnesses were punishments from God. Leeches, prayers, and superstition ruled the art of healing. But from the east, across deserts and seas, a quiet light began to travel, the light that glowed from the bimaristans of Baghdad. It began with the travelers, merchants, scholars, and diplomats who passed through the city. They saw the hospitals with their separate wards, their water channels, their rows of physicians consulting calmly instead of chanting incantations. They heard of libraries filled with medical manuscripts, copied not only in Arabic but also translated from Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit. When these travelers returned westward, to Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, they carried more than stories. They carried books. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the spirit of Baghdad's healing began to take root in other great cities of Islam. The Abbasid Empire was vast, stretching from the mountains of Persia to the sands of Morocco, and wherever it spread, so did the idea of organized, rational medicine. In Damascus, the Nuri Hospital would later rise, founded by Nur al-Din Zangi in the 12th century, modeled after the Baghdad bimaristans. Its marble courtyards and flowing fountains reflected the same compassion, the same methodical care. The records of that hospital still survive. Detailed patient notes, pharmacy inventories, even the names of attending doctors. In Cairo, under the Fatimid caliphs, hospitals became even grander. One such place, the Al-Mansuri bimaristan, founded in 1284, could host over 8,000 patients. Each ward was specialized: internal medicine, ophthalmology, surgery, fevers, mental illness. Food was served on silver trays, not to display wealth but to maintain hygiene, silver being known even then for its antimicrobial properties. All of these were echoes of Baghdad's first hospitals, shaped by its philosophy that healing must be both humane and scientific. Far beyond the Mediterranean, word of these hospitals reached scholars in southern Italy and Spain. In places like Toledo, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars lived side by side, translation schools began to flourish. There, the medical works born in Baghdad were rendered into Latin, the language of Europe's learning. Imagine a candlelit room in Toledo, around the year 1150. A Muslim scholar recites from Al-Razi's comprehensive book on medicine. Beside him sits a Jewish translator, murmuring the words in Hebrew. And at the table's end, a Christian monk copies them into Latin, line by careful line. Through this chain of languages, the wisdom of Baghdad crossed cultural frontiers. Texts like Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine became the foundation of medical education in Europe for centuries. From the University of Bologna to Paris and Oxford, students studied these Arabic works long after Baghdad itself had fallen into ruin. Even in the 17th century, European physicians still cited Avicenna, Ibn Sina, as their ultimate authority. But few of them ever realized where it all began. Few knew of the bimaristans, of the wards with their fountains, of the soft light falling on white stone, of the patients healed by reason instead of ritual. To imagine the shock of those early European travelers, picture one arriving in Baghdad around the 10th century. He would find streets alive with calligraphers and astronomers, glassmakers and perfumers, and then, upon entering the hospital gates, a sight entirely foreign, he would see order, cleanliness, calm system of care. Patients were not chained, as they often were in Europe, nor made to confess their sins before treatment. Instead, they were greeted by physicians who asked questions. When did the pain begin? What do you feel after eating? How do you sleep? To the medieval European mind, this was revolutionary. To the people of Baghdad, it was simply Islamic duty, a mercy commanded by faith. For Islam taught that the body was a trust, a gift from God, and that to heal the sick was among the most blessed of deeds. By the 11th century, the idea of the hospital as an institution, not a shelter, not a church hospice, but a place of learning and healing, had spread to Europe through Sicily and Spain. The first European hospitals inspired by this model began to appear in cities like Salerno and Montpellier. But they were modest compared to their Eastern ancestors. Still, the influence was undeniable. European physicians began to separate medicine from theology, to emphasize hygiene, and to use detailed patient observation. It was the slow rebirth of scientific thought, and much of its seed came from Baghdad's forgotten wards. Yet even as the West began to rise, the East began to darken. By the 13th century, Baghdad faced invasions, political fractures, and decline. The libraries that had once glowed with oil lamps and knowledge grew quiet. And in 1258, when the Mongols swept into the city, the Tigris was said to have run black with ink, the ink of the destroyed manuscripts from the House of Wisdom. Many of the great bimaristans were burned. Physicians fled or were killed. But even amid ruin, the memory of their methods survived, carried westward in copied books and grateful minds. Those who had once studied in Baghdad carried the flame to Damascus, to Cairo, to Granada, and from there to the world. Centuries later, when Florence and Paris built their own great hospitals, the echoes of Baghdad could still be heard in the architecture, the separate wards, the courtyards, the flowing water. Even the word hospital came, indirectly, from the Arabic bimaristan, through translations and Latin adaptations. Baghdad had been centuries ahead of its time. It had built a system where health was a right, where medicine was grounded in reason, and where care was both a science and a mercy. The West would eventually claim these ideas as its own, but the truth remains carved in history, that in the heart of the medieval world, long before Europe's medical awakening, there stood a city where healing was already modern. A city where every breath of the sick was tended, every fever measured, and every cure tested, and where, for the first time in human history, hospitals became temples of knowledge. The morning light creeps slowly into the bimaristan's courtyards, gilding the marble tiles and awakening the quiet hum of another day. The air carries the faint scent of jasmine from the hospital gardens and the crisp aroma of freshly boiled herbs. Water murmurs in the fountains, cool and constant, a sound that soothes even before medicine begins its work. The gates open at dawn. Patients arrive in small groups, some limping, some carried on litters, others walking with bowed heads. The poor are welcomed first. No one is turned away. The doors of the bimaristan are open to all, for illness recognizes no rank. A clerk sits by the gate, dipping his reed pen into black ink, recording each name on parchment. He asks softly, "Where does it hurt? How long have you suffered?" These words are more than formality. They are the first act of care. Behind him, attendants in clean white garments help the weak to benches shaded by palms. The calm of the place is almost holy. One can hear the distant cooing of pigeons on the roof, the whisper of sandals, the rhythmic beating of a pestle in the pharmacy. Soon, the chief physician appears, flanked by students and assistants. His robe is simple linen, but his presence commands reverence. His eyes are calm, his voice steady, his hands precise. He begins his rounds. Each ward awaits him like a chapter in a great book. First, the ward of fevers. Rows of patients resting on low beds, their foreheads cool with rose-water-soaked cloths. A nurse moves gently from one to another, fanning them with palm leaves. On a table near the window, bowls of pomegranate juice glisten like rubies. The physician touches a patient's wrist, feeling the rhythm of life beneath the skin. "The pulse is quicker than yesterday," he murmurs. The students listen, writing down every word. Observation is everything. No superstition, no blind faith. Only what the body reveals. Next, the ward of wounds and fractures. Here the smell of vinegar and resin mingles with the faint sweetness of honey, the antiseptics of the age. A surgeon, sleeves rolled high, adjusts a splint bound in clean linen. He speaks gently to his patient, explaining each movement before he makes it. This too is part of the treatment, kindness. The tools on the nearby tray shine in the morning light. Scalpels, hooks, forceps, needles. Each is washed in wine or boiled water before and after use. The surgeons of Baghdad learned long ago that cleanliness saved more lives than prayer alone. By mid-morning, the courtyard fills with the soft murmur of instruction. Beneath the colonnade, students gather for the day's lecture. Some are young, their eyes bright with curiosity. Others older, already healers in smaller towns. The chief physician sits upon a wooden chair, a patient seated before him. "This man," he says, "complains of heaviness after eating. Tell me, what do you observe?" One student notes the man's pallor. Another comments on his pulse. A third recalls a passage from Hippocrates, yet the teacher smiles and shakes his head. "Do not trust words alone," he says. "Trust the signs of the body. Listen to the breath. Smell the tongue. Ask questions." They do. The lesson continues, soft yet alive with precision. It is not just medicine that is being taught here, but a way of seeing. The lecture ends with a reading from Al-Razi's Kitab al-Hawi, a book that has traveled through countless hands, its pages darkened by oil lamps and fingerprints. The students write down every phrase, for books are precious, and memory even more so. Past the wards lies the Saydalania, the pharmacy. Its shelves rise high, crowded with jars and flasks of every size. The air is heavy with scent. Mint, saffron, musk, and camphor mingle with the earthy smell of ground herbs. The chief pharmacist, an elderly man with steady hands, prepares medicines in quiet concentration. His mortar and pestle beat out a rhythm that seems to echo the heartbeat of the hospital. Powders are mixed with honey or rosewater to make electuaries. Syrups are poured into glass bottles sealed with wax. On each, the name of the medicine is written in elegant Kufic script. Zanjabil for digestion, cust for fever, myrrh for pain. Every patient receives their medicine with a written note, a prescription signed by the physician. Copies are kept in the records room, so that future doctors may study the results. It is the foundation of evidence-based practice, centuries before that phrase would exist. And above the pharmacy, in small loft rooms, young apprentices learn the art of compound making. They memorize the weights, the measures, and the balance of the elements, not merely to imitate but to understand. Beyond the main courtyard lies a quieter section, where the air is cool and perfumed with burning amber. This is the ward for the mentally unwell, a place of great tenderness. Here patients are not chained or mocked, but soothed. They are spoken to gently, bathed in warm water, and given clean clothing. Physicians sit beside them, listening more than they speak. Music fills the air, soft notes of the oud and ney drifting over the fountains. Melancholy is a sickness of the heart, one physician explains, and music is its medicine. Poets sometimes visit, reciting verses of Rumi and Mutanabi, reminding the patients that the mind can heal as the body does, slowly, in rhythm with kindness. This humane treatment astonishes travelers from distant lands. Centuries later, when European chroniclers wrote of their journeys to the East, they described these wards with wonder. Hospitals for the soul, they called them. As the sun lowers, the bimaristan glows gold. The call to prayer rises from the nearby mosque, and physicians pause their work to bow in silence. The day's records are gathered and sealed. Attendants change the linens and sweep the corridors with palm brooms. The scent of sandalwood returns, burning in small clay pots to purify the air. In the courtyards, lamps are lit one by one, their light trembling across the water. The city beyond is noisy, but inside these walls there is only stillness. A stillness built by reason and compassion. When night comes fully, only the watch physicians remain, walking softly through the wards, checking pulses, adjusting pillows, whispering to those who dream uneasily. A city might sleep, but the bimaristan never truly does. It breathes through the night, as steady as the Tigris itself. The bimaristan of Baghdad was not only a place of science but a theater of quiet human drama. Every patient, every physician, every whispered prayer and measured breath, became part of a tapestry woven by compassion and intellect. To walk its halls was to feel the pulse of a civilization that believed knowledge was mercy made visible. Let us wander those wards together now, and listen, not to legend but to history. For the bimaristans kept records, and in those fragile pages, the lives of real people still stir softly across the centuries. One such record tells of a merchant who came to the hospital complaining of sleeplessness. He had not rested for many nights. His eyes were ringed with shadows, his pulse quick and unsteady. The physicians questioned him gently, about his food, his thoughts, his sorrows. When they found no illness of the body, they sent him to the ward for the mind. There he was given a light meal of rice and almond milk, then bathed in warm water infused with lavender. As the evening deepened, a musician sat near his bed, plucking the oud softly, the melody slow and circular like waves. The physician wrote in his notes. The sound entered the man's heart before it reached his ears. By dawn, the merchant had fallen into deep sleep, the first in many days. And when he awoke, he wept in gratitude. Not because the pain had vanished, but because he had been treated as a human being, not a sinner or a fool. Another tale, from the surgical records of Al-Razi's students, describes a boy brought in with a fractured arm. His father, a potter, had no money for care, but the bimaristan's gatekeeper welcomed them without question. The surgeon examined the arm by touch, not by haste. He compared it to the other limb, measured the swelling, and noted the boy's pain when he moved his wrist. Then, with calm precision, he prepared a splint of smooth tamarisk wood, wrapped in linen soaked in gum arabic. The surgeon spoke softly to the boy throughout, explaining each movement. When the splint was set, he bound it with a strip of clean cotton and dipped the fingers in cool rosewater to ease the heat. The record ends with this line. The boy left the bimaristan smiling, and his father left a jar of clay as his gift. No money changed hands. For treatment in Baghdad's hospitals was free, supported by waqf, charitable endowments given by the pious to serve the sick. It was perhaps the first form of public health care in the world. In another ward, a woman sat quietly with a veil over her face. She had come from the countryside, her vision clouding more each day. The physicians of the eye ward, specialists known as kahalan, examined her with polished mirrors and thin metal probes. They diagnosed the early stage of cataract, a condition then called almoe al-bayda, the white water. In Europe, centuries later, blindness of this kind would still be treated by superstition or left to fate. But in Baghdad, surgery for cataracts was already known. The procedure, called couching, required steadiness and grace. The surgeon held a fine needle, made of gold or bronze, and gently dislodged the clouded lens to restore light to the eye. It was dangerous, yes, but sometimes successful. The woman's record ends simply. She could once again see the color of her daughter's dress. And there, in that sentence, is all the miracle one needs. When plague swept parts of the empire, fear rippled through the people. But the physicians of Baghdad did not run. They observed, recorded, and sought patterns. One scholar-physician, Ibn al-Khatib of Granada, himself inspired by earlier Baghdad doctors, would later write that contagion was carried by invisible particles from one body to another. He advised quarantine, clean air, and burning of infected materials, principles that Europe would rediscover only centuries later. Even in Baghdad's early days, such reasoning was born in the wards. Doctors compared notes, measuring the spread of fever, counting the days between symptoms, and drawing maps of the affected quarters. They prayed, yes, but they also thought. And in their thinking they built the first stones of epidemiology. In the library of one bimaristan, beneath the shadow of the House of Wisdom, a young apprentice copied his master's notes by lamplight. He wrote of fever and pulse, of urine color and sleep patterns, but more than that, he wrote of conduct. The physician must be gentle, the master had said. He must not display wealth before the poor, nor scorn their ignorance. He must not promise life where God has written death, but he must always offer comfort. For comfort itself is a form of healing. The apprentice copied those words carefully, his ink slow, his breath even. He did not know that this idea, of bedside manner, of ethics in medicine, would become the moral compass of physicians for 1,000 years. As centuries passed, the records grew thinner. Wars, invasions, and neglect slowly dimmed the brilliance of Baghdad. Some bimaristans fell into ruin, their marble halls silent, their fountains dry. But the method survived, in Egypt, in Damascus, in Persia, in Spain. And through the translation schools of Toledo and Sicily, they entered the Latin world, where scholars marveled at the Arab books of healing. Even the word pharmacy traces its ancestry to these places. From Saidala, the art of compounding. Every mortar, every flask, every healing recipe whispered of a time when medicine was a sacred duty, not a trade. In the evening, when the last patient slept, the doctors would gather by the fountains to reflect. The stars shimmered above, mirrored in the rippling water. They spoke softly, not of power or fame, but of balance, of the harmony between body, mind, and world. They believed that illness was a disharmony, a disruption of the music of life. And so they sought not merely to cure, but to restore that music, with herbs, with touch, with words, with compassion. One might imagine them now, their white robes faintly glowing in the lamplight, their voices drifting like the wind through the palms. A civilization speaking softly to itself, saying, "Knowledge without kindness is ignorance disguised." The sun dips low over Baghdad, spilling molten gold across the domes and riverbanks. From the upper balcony of the Aladdudi bimaristan, one could look out and see a city that breathed knowledge. Minarets caught the light like spears of wisdom. Marketplaces echoed with the cries of vendors selling saffron, figs, and parchment. And within the bimaristan's marble walls, the hum of life continued, a soft, organized rhythm of care and discovery. Inside, the wards had grown quieter for the evening. The heat of the day had waned, replaced by a cool breeze drifting from the Tigris. Water murmured in fountains, and nurses, many trained by the physicians themselves, walked softly across tiled corridors, carrying basins, herbal infusions, or simple bowls of barley water. Each corner of the bimaristan was alive with a purpose. In one hall, a young apprentice measured a patient's pulse using the time it took for sand to fall through a narrow glass, an early form of timing devices before mechanical clocks became common. He whispered the patient's name, checked their breathing, then scribbled his notes in neat Arabic script. In another, a surgeon carefully sterilized his bronze instruments in hot water scented with vinegar and thyme. The practice might seem ordinary to us now, but in the 10th century it was a revolution. In Europe, barbers bled patients with dull knives. In Baghdad, physicians cleaned wounds, used sutures of silk, and understood, vaguely but wisely, that cleanliness saved lives. This devotion to science and hygiene was not isolated to the hospital. It reflected the entire intellectual climate of the Abbasid world. The caliphs of Baghdad, especially those like Al-Ma'mun, were patrons of inquiry. They gathered scholars from Greece, Persia, and India to translate great works of medicine and philosophy into Arabic. These translations filled the shelves of the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, just across the river from the bimaristan. From there, knowledge flowed freely, like the Tigris itself, into hospitals, schools, and homes. You can almost hear it now. The scratching of reed pens on parchment, the soft debates between doctors over the humors of the body, the distant call to prayer blending with the rustle of palm leaves. The bimaristan was more than a hospital. It was a microcosm of the city's intellect. In one wing, the psychiatric ward echoed softly with the pluck of a oud. Music therapy was practiced here, a treatment for melancholy and anxiety. Patients reclined on cushions beside the courtyard, listening to slow, repetitive melodies meant to soothe the soul. Physicians believed that harmony in sound could restore harmony within the mind. Water therapy was also a form of healing. The sound of flowing fountains, the coolness of marble underfoot, the scent of jasmine. These were not luxuries but medicines for the spirit. Every patient, whether wealthy or poor, Muslim or non-Muslim, was treated with dignity. The Quranic principle of compassion guided their work. Whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved all of mankind. At night, the hospital became even more enchanting. Oil lamps burned gently along the hallways, casting amber halos on the arches. Shadows danced over the intricate calligraphy carved into the walls, verses about mercy, healing, and knowledge. A clerk sat under one of these lamps, copying the notes of Ibn al-Ruhawi, a physician who had written about medical ethics centuries before Europe's Hippocratic revival. His text insisted that doctors must treat every patient with humility and care, not for fame but for the soul's reward. Nearby, a senior doctor named Abu al-Hassan dictated to his students, "Observe always, and write what you observe. The eye may see what the mind forgets, but the ink remembers." His students, wide-eyed and reverent, nodded as they dipped their pens. They wore simple linen robes, but each bore the quiet pride of being part of something larger, a living tradition of science, faith, and service. One of them, a young man from Khorasan, would later return home and build his own bimaristan, modeled exactly after this one. Thus, from Baghdad, the art of hospital care spread eastward to Persia, Samarkand, and even India. In the kitchens below, herbalists ground ingredients into fine powders: cinnamon, myrrh, black seed, camphor. The smell was intoxicating. These were the ingredients for syrups, tonics, and poultices. Pharmacists, known as Saydalani, worked beside physicians, adjusting prescriptions according to climate, age, and temperament. The bimaristan's pharmacy was open to the public as well, and travelers often came from afar to collect remedies or advice. By midnight, the city outside had quieted. The Tigris shimmered under a pale moon, and a lone muezzin's voice carried softly from a distant minaret. Within the bimaristan, nurses tended to sleeping patients, their movements slow and deliberate. Somewhere, a physician paused to gaze at the night sky through a lattice window, his breath misting faintly in the cool air. He might have thought of how small humanity was, yet how luminous its pursuit of knowledge could be. And as he turned back to his desk, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the generations who would continue the work. For in Baghdad's golden age, the pulse of healing was not confined to flesh and bone. It beat in the heart of civilization itself. World, yet ideas once released had wings. And from Baghdad's bimaristans, the wings of medicine began to spread outward, riding with travelers, pilgrims, and scholars. The knowledge born beside the Tigris would ripple far beyond its shimmering banks. Imagine the caravans setting out from Baghdad in the cool dawn. Camels padded softly on the sand, their hooves muffled beneath loads of parchment and medicines wrapped in silk. Among them were physicians, calm, deliberate men wearing white turbans, carrying with them the wisdom of their masters. They traveled toward Persia, Syria, Egypt, and Andalusia, where cities like Cordoba and Cairo awaited. In Cordoba, the Muslim West mirrored the Muslim East. Its caliphs built universities, observatories, and hospitals inspired by Baghdad's example. The bimaristan of Cordoba, one of the earliest in Europe, bore the same design. A large courtyard surrounded by wards, a steady water fountain in the center, open air, clean light. Patients there received food, treatment, and a bed, not as beggars but as guests. The very word bimaristan became a model of civilization, so much so that when Christian travelers later visited, they wrote about these houses of healing with awe. In contrast, Europe's medical care at that time remained trapped within superstition. Monks prayed for the sick. Bloodletting, leeches, and relics dominated the treatment. Hospitals, if one could call them that, were attached to monasteries and served more as refuges for the dying than places of cure. But from the east came whispers of something different. Scholars returning from Toledo and Palermo brought back translated medical texts, the writings of Al-Razi, Rhazes, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Al-Zarawi, Abulcasis. Each of these physicians was shaped by the bimaristan system of Baghdad, the rigorous observation, the ethical practice, the clean wards. The most famous of them, Ibn Sina, though born in Persia, built on the knowledge preserved by Baghdad's libraries. His canon of medicine, composed in the 11th century, would become the cornerstone of European medical education for over 600 years. In it, he described diseases, anatomy, and pharmacology in precise, systematic order, a reflection of the hospital organization he admired. Let us return for a moment to one such hospital. Walk with me softly through its corridors again, but this time in Damascus. The Nur al-Din bimaristan, built in the 12th century, stood as a direct descendant of the Baghdadi model. Water flowed through its marble channels, cooling the air. The central courtyard was open to the sky, where vines climbed along pillars and the scent of orange blossoms mingled with antiseptic herbs. Here, patients from all walks of life found care. Each ward specialized in a type of illness: fever, eye diseases, wounds, mental distress. Physicians made daily rounds. Pharmacists distributed measured doses. And at the end of each day, students gathered under lanterns to record observations, just as their predecessors had done in Baghdad. The architecture itself was medicine, calm, symmetrical, and bright. It whispered to the soul, "You are not forgotten." From Damascus, the model traveled to Cairo. There, Sultan Qalawun in the 13th century established a vast bimaristan, a structure so grand that chroniclers described it as a palace for the sick. Its marble halls stretched for hundreds of feet. Its pharmacy offered hundreds of compounds, recorded in ledgers with meticulous care. Its staff were salaried by the state, a system of organized healthcare that would not appear in Europe until centuries later. Imagine the sound inside that Cairo hospital at dusk. The rustle of robes, the clink of copper basins, the bubbling of perfumed water. Physicians discussed the pulse, the humors, the color of urine. Apprentices took notes under the light of oil lamps. And through the open arches drifted the distant hum of the city, donkey carts creaking, calls to prayer fading into the night. Meanwhile, in Europe, a quiet transformation had begun. The Crusades, though born of conflict, also became channels of cultural exchange. Western knights and clerics, encountering the hospitals of Syria and Palestine, returned home astonished. They had seen order, hygiene, and compassion unlike anything in their lands. The first hospitals in Christian Europe to follow Islamic organization appeared in Italy and Spain. The Hospital of Santa Maria della Scala in Siena, the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, and others began to mirror the efficiency of their Muslim counterparts. Architectural plans borrowed the courtyard layout. Water features and ventilation were copied. Record-keeping and separation of patients by illness became standard practice. And in medical universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, translations of Arabic medical works became textbooks. When European scholars spoke of physic, they were often quoting Ibn Sina or Al-Razi without realizing it. The ripple from Baghdad had reached the Atlantic. But the original heartbeat, that quiet, compassionate rhythm, still pulsed strongest in the East. In Baghdad, even centuries after its founding, the Al-Adudi bimaristan continued to operate. The city's later rulers maintained it as a center of study and care. Chroniclers describe new wards being added, surgical tools improved, and records copied for teaching. Every generation left a mark upon its marble. Every physician added a line to its great book of life. And though the Mongol fires would one day consume the House of Wisdom, scattering its books to the wind, the spirit of the bimaristan could not be burned. It had already migrated into languages, into hearts, into the very definition of medicine itself. When we speak today of hospitals, of wards, of medical ethics and teaching, we are, in truth, still speaking the language of Baghdad. Soon we shall enter the twilight of this golden age, and see how its light endured even through ruin. The wind from the east carried with it the scent of iron and smoke. In the year 1258, Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid world, trembled. The Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan had arrived at its gates. Behind them the world seemed to darken. For centuries the city had been a beacon, its domes glimmering with wisdom, its streets alive with scholars, merchants and poets. But now, all that brilliance flickered under the shadow of war. The Tigris, once a mirror for the stars, would soon run black with ink and red with blood. Inside the Al-Adudi bimaristan, physicians still moved quietly among the sick. They had heard rumors, the burning of towns, the fall of fortresses, but they continued their rounds. Perhaps they believed, with a kind of fragile hope, that mercy might protect the place of healing. But outside, the thunder of hooves grew louder. When the Mongols entered the city, they showed no mercy. Palaces, markets, and mosques were set ablaze. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, that vast library where centuries of knowledge had been gathered, was looted. Its scrolls were flung into the river. For days, the Tigris ran dark with the dissolved ink of 1,000 lifetimes of learning. Witnesses later said the river turned black, then red. The ink of books and the blood of scholars mingled in its current. And yet, amid the ruin something endured. In one corner of the city, a physician named Ibn al-Tilmid refused to flee. He and his apprentices hid patients in the hospital cellars, covering the doors with sacks of grain to disguise the entry. They whispered to each other under the low light of oil lamps, soft voices in a world gone mad. He knew the Mongols would not understand what this place was. A sanctuary for all, not a fortress. He knew, too, that their rage could not extinguish the flame of knowledge, only scatter its sparks. For every book burned, there were copies elsewhere, in Damascus, in Cairo, in Cordoba. For every physician slain, another student had already carried his words onward. When the fire subsided and the invaders withdrew, Baghdad lay in ashes. But the bimaristan's walls still stood, cracked, blackened but unbroken. The marble fountains were filled with soot. The wards were empty, the instruments rusting in the silence. And yet, before long, a few survivors returned. They swept the floors. They rekindled the lamps. A single sound broke the stillness, the drip of clean water from a cracked fountainhead. From that sound, a city began to heal. Over the following decades, new rulers would rebuild Baghdad. The Mongols themselves, now rulers of the land they had ravaged, came to appreciate what they had destroyed. Hulagu's descendants, the Ilkhanids, embraced Islam. They reopened schools, revived libraries, and sponsored hospitals once more, inspired ironically by the very model they had nearly erased. In time, the medical tradition of the bimaristan found new life in other centers of learning, in Cairo, Damascus, Samarkand, and Isfahan. Each city became a lantern lit from Baghdad's dying flame. In Damascus, Ibn al-Nafis, a scholar-physician trained in the bimaristan system, made a discovery that would change history. He described the pulmonary circulation of blood, how it moves from the heart to the lungs and back, 3 centuries before William Harvey in Europe. His writings, preserved in Arabic, would one day be translated and recognized as one of medicine's great breakthroughs. That too was Baghdad's legacy. Knowledge unbound by borders, surviving beyond empire. Meanwhile, in the far west, the hospitals of Andalusia continued to operate. Even as the Reconquista advanced, Christian rulers retained Muslim physicians, respecting their skill and ethics. The word hospital itself, drawn from Latin hosps, guest, took on new meaning through the influence of the Islamic bimaristan, a place not of exclusion but of care. And so, the seed of compassion planted in the Abbasid capital continued to grow. Think of it now. Centuries after the last lamp was extinguished in the House of Wisdom, the ideas that were born there would shape the Renaissance. European scholars rediscovered reason, science, and anatomy, often through the works of Arabic medicine translated back into Latin. The writings of Al-Razi and Ibn Sina filled the shelves of medieval universities in Paris and Padua. The chain was unbroken, fragile perhaps, but alive. And when modern hospitals emerged in Europe, places with specialized wards, clean water, trained staff and ethical codes, they were unknowingly echoing the rhythm of Baghdad's bimaristans. Imagine that rhythm now. The steady footsteps of nurses in linen robes. The low hum of prayer between treatments. The rustle of reeds on parchment, recording symptoms and cures. The trickle of water in a courtyard where orange trees still bloom. Even in ruin that sound remained. Centuries passed. Dynasties rose and fell. But in every place where a doctor listened carefully, where a patient was treated with dignity, where a student observed rather than assumed, there was a whisper of Baghdad. The Mongols had burned the city, yes. But the idea of mercy, of learning, of healing, those are things no fire can consume. The story of Baghdad's bimaristans now moves beyond walls and wars. In the next part, we'll follow how their echoes reached the early modern world, the Ottoman hospitals, the European medical academies, and even the philosophies of modern care. The centuries that followed the fall of Baghdad were marked not only by the ruins left behind, but by the quiet rebuilding of knowledge. The world had changed, yet the memory of the bimaristan had not faded. Its ideas flowed onward like the Tigris itself, splitting into many tributaries that would nourish new civilizations. By the 15th century, the Islamic world had stretched wide, from the sands of Arabia to the palaces of Andalusia, from the bazaars of Cairo to the gardens of Samarkand. And everywhere that knowledge traveled, so too did the design, ethics, and discipline of the bimaristan. In the Ottoman Empire, these ideas were given new breath. When Sultan Bayezid II built his great hospital in Edirne in the late 1400s, it was no ordinary building. Its architecture echoed the ancient hospitals of Baghdad. A grand courtyard, rooms arranged by specialty, a fountain at the center to soothe the ear and spirit. But there was something more. Music therapy had returned. Ottoman physicians believed, as their Abbasid predecessors once had, that sound could heal the heart and mind. In Edirne's hospital, trained musicians played modes, maqams, each chosen to stir a specific emotion or balance a certain temperament. The melodies floated through the arched corridors, blending with the murmur of fountains and the scent of lavender. Patients reclined on low couches, their eyes half closed, as the oud and ney wove gentle patterns in the air. This was not mysticism, it was a continuation of science shaped by empathy. The Ottomans, like the Abbasids before them, understood that healing was as much about the spirit as the body. Beyond Edirne, new hospitals rose in Istanbul, Damascus, and Cairo, each inheriting the blueprint of Baghdad's bimaristans. Wards were separated by illness. Pharmacists measured doses precisely. Doctors trained apprentices through observation, not rote belief. Even hospital funding followed the old pattern, through Waqf, charitable endowments that made care free for the poor. These institutions were so well organized that when European travelers visited Ottoman lands in the 16th and 17th centuries, they recorded their astonishment. A French observer wrote, "Here the sick are treated without fee or favor, and the physicians are learned in the arts of Galen and Avicenna. The place is more like a palace than a house of suffering." That palace description was not exaggeration. Many Ottoman hospitals were architectural marvels, domed chambers with perfect acoustics, flowing air, and sunlight filtered through colored glass. Everything about their design spoke of harmony, a concept deeply rooted in Islamic medicine. Meanwhile, in Europe, the echoes grew louder. By now, Arabic medical texts had become standard reading in universities. Students of medicine in Padua, Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris learned anatomy and diagnosis through the works of Ibn Sina, al-Razi, and Ibn al-Nafis. They debated the four humors, pulse diagnosis, and hygiene, all ideas refined in the bimaristans of Baghdad. Slowly, the medieval European almshouse, a place for the poor and dying, began to evolve into something resembling the hospital as we know it. By the 17th century, European hospitals began adopting features that had long existed in the Islamic world. Separate wards for different diseases, record-keeping of patient symptoms and outcomes, state or religious funding to ensure care for all, formal medical education tied to hospital practice. This transformation was not a coincidence. It was the distant reverberation of Baghdad's original vision: medicine as a public duty, science as a moral act. And in some quiet irony, when European colonial powers later returned to the Middle East centuries later, they often built modern hospitals on the same principles their ancestors had learned from the East. Brick and stone changed, but the philosophy remained the same. Let's pause and breathe in this thought. The hospitals of today, the clean wards, the gentle hum of machines, the quiet rhythm of footsteps in hallways, are distant descendants of a dream born beside the Tigris 1,000 years ago. That dream was not just to cure but to care. To look upon another human being and see not their sickness, but their soul. If you close your eyes now, you might imagine a thread of sound running across time. The murmur of the Tigris, the pluck of a lute in an Ottoman ward, the scratch of a quill in a Renaissance lecture hall, the faint beep of a heart monitor in a modern hospital room. It is the same sound, the sound of healing. In the 19th century, when Florence Nightingale reformed nursing during the Crimean War, she too studied the hospitals of the Ottoman Empire. She admired their cleanliness, their order, and their respect for patient welfare. In her letters, she wrote of the care shown by Muslim nurses, their quiet discipline and their insistence on washing hands, beds, and instruments regularly. Thus, even in modern nursing, the echo of the bimaristan can still be heard. From Baghdad to Edirne, from Edirne to London, the journey of healing had crossed not only lands but centuries. And though the world around it changed, empires rose, science advanced, technology emerged, the essence remained. Healing must be guided by compassion. Knowledge must serve humanity. And hospitals must be places of mercy, not profit. The bimaristans had been centuries ahead of their time, not only in medicine but in humanity itself. In the next part we shall move closer to the present, to how the legacy of the bimaristan survived through language, architecture, and ethics, even as modernity transformed the world around it. The centuries have turned like pages in a great book, each one bearing traces of the ink that came before. And if you listen carefully, even now, you can hear the quiet echo of the Baghdad bimaristan, not in ruins or relics, but in the rhythm of every hospital that still stands today. Let us return to the sound of footsteps on tile, not marble now, but linoleum. The scent of antiseptic replaces that of rosewater. Machines hum where fountains once whispered. And yet, beneath it all, the same philosophy endures: the art of healing as an act of mercy. In the modern age, hospitals are vast, technological cities of care. Machines blink, monitors pulse, and doctors move in quiet precision. But the order, the division of wards, the respect for hygiene, the concept of specialized treatment, these are all gifts inherited from the ancient world of Islam's golden age. If we trace them carefully, each modern practice finds its ancestor in Baghdad's bimaristans. Today, medical students in every corner of the world shadow physicians, take patient histories, and observe operations. This tradition began in Baghdad. In the 10th century, students gathered around bedsides, learning diagnosis and treatment directly from masters like al-Razi and Ibn Sina. They recorded symptoms, compared cases, and discussed outcomes, the same method modern medicine still uses. Before Europe's discovery of germs, Baghdad's doctors understood that cleanliness prolonged life. Bimaristans had flowing water, daily baths for patients, and regular laundering of linens. Modern sanitation protocols, from sterile instruments to hand washing, are the direct descendants of this principle. Every doctor today swears an oath to protect life, respect patients, and do no harm. That spirit, too, can be traced to the Adab al-Tabib, the conduct of a physician, written by Ishaq al-Rahawi in the 9th century. His book described how doctors should treat their patients gently, never abandon the sick, and guard their secrets. It even demanded accountability. Physicians who caused harm through negligence were investigated by peers. The idea that hospital design influences recovery, that light, space, and calm surroundings matter, is ancient. Bimaristans were built around courtyards with fountains and gardens, where the sound of water soothed the heart. Today, modern architects design healing environments, adding windows, gardens, and natural light for the same reason. Centuries before psychiatry was recognized as a science, Islamic physicians treated mental illness with care and respect. Bimaristans offered therapy through sound and environment, not punishment or imprisonment. Their music therapy, long forgotten, is now reborn in the West under clinical names. Sound therapy, art therapy, music healing. These are not coincidences. They are the slow diffusion of an idea too profound to die. That medicine must serve both the body and the soul. Now picture this. You walk through a modern hospital. The fluorescent lights hum softly. Nurses whisper to each other, pushing carts laden with medicine. In one room, a doctor leans close to a patient's bed, listening with calm eyes. It feels clinical, mechanical, but if you close your eyes, you can almost see the old world shimmering beneath. The white coats are the linen robes of Abbasid physicians. The chart clipped to the bed is a parchment on a wooden board. The foredrip is the slow trickle of water from a marble fountain. The soft monitor beeps are echoes of the oud's slow, healing rhythm. Every element, every action, observation, empathy, documentation, bears the fingerprints of Baghdad's long-ago healers. Even the structure of global health owes something to the bimaristan model. The WACF system, endowments created to provide free care, evolved into the concept of public health care. Charitable hospitals, community clinics, and welfare medicine all mirror the idea that society shares responsibility for the sick. The modern term hospital ward stems from the Arabic riyash and dar, meaning chambers or houses. The architectural vocabulary of healing migrated with the knowledge. In recent decades, historians have begun to uncover just how deep this influence runs. The word pharmacy comes from the Arabic saydalani. The term clinic, from Greek klein, bed, found its living counterpart in the Arabic bimaristan, where care was centered around the patient's bed, not the doctor's office. Even the hospital record, the case file, has a twin in the notebooks of medieval Baghdad, where every treatment was written down and reviewed. The echoes persist not only in practice but in philosophy. When the World Health Organization declared health to be a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, it was unknowingly repeating the holistic vision of early Islamic medicine. In those old Baghdad halls, physicians believed that a body could not heal if the soul was in despair, that music, prayer, nature, and conversation were part of the cure. How modern that sounds today, and yet how ancient it truly is. Now imagine the scene as twilight falls over a contemporary hospital. A nurse adjusts a blanket, her movements rhythmic and kind. In another room, a doctor writes notes under the glow of a screen. The air smells of antiseptic and quiet worry. Outside, traffic murmurs like a distant river. And somewhere in that calm, a patient closes his eyes, breathing slowly, not knowing that the philosophy behind the care he receives was born over 1,000 years ago in a city of gold and knowledge beside the Tigris. This is the unseen inheritance, the human chain that stretches from the hands of Al-Razi and Ibn Sina to every nurse, every doctor, every healer of our time. It is not just a lineage of science but of compassion. Soon we'll reach the final part, the last breath of the story, where the world falls quiet again, and we reflect on what endures when empires fade and knowledge travels beyond centuries. The years turned, and the city that once glittered like 1,000 stars dimmed under the shadow of conquest. Baghdad, the cradle of science, medicine, and light, fell to the Mongols in the year 1258. The Tigris ran black, they said, with the ink of countless manuscripts thrown into its waters. The scent of burning parchment lingered over the city for weeks. It was the end of a golden age. And yet, even as the flames rose, something invisible survived, not in buildings or libraries, but in memory. Those who escaped carried more than sorrow. They carried knowledge. Doctors, students, and scholars fled westward, their minds laden with the teachings of centuries. They took with them the wisdom of the Bimaristans, the lessons of Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, Al-Zarawi, and others. Through Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and eventually across the Mediterranean, these ideas trickled into Europe, sometimes translated, sometimes stolen, sometimes reborn under new names. A physician in Salerno studies a Latin manuscript, unaware that the original text had once been written in Arabic script. A student in Montpellier memorizes the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, never realizing it came from the dusty halls of a Baghdad hospital. In Paris, a medieval doctor consults a text on contagion, wondering how its author, Rhazes, could have understood infection centuries before the Black Death. And slowly, through layers of translation and adaptation, the Bimaristan's soul seeped into Western medicine. The bedside approach, the teaching rounds, the documentation of symptoms, the ethical care of patients, all reappeared, reshaped but familiar, as if Baghdad had whispered through time. It is strange, isn't it? How ideas can travel farther than armies. How compassion can outlive empire. In Europe, the term hospital evolved from hospitium, a place of hospitality, originally built for travelers and the poor. But as the centuries unfolded, the influence of Islamic medicine reshaped it into something broader, a place of healing for all. By the Renaissance, when anatomy, surgery, and hygiene began to flourish again, Europe was rediscovering what the East had known for centuries. The Bimaristan had planted the seed. Now, in new soil, it took root again. Still much was lost. The spiritual harmony that once guided Baghdad's physicians, the unity between mind, body, and environment, became fragmented in the age of specialization. Hospitals grew larger, colder, more mechanical. Yet deep beneath the surface, the ancient design endured, like the foundation of an old building hidden under new walls. Let us imagine a moment. You are walking through a modern teaching hospital. The corridors echo faintly with footsteps, and somewhere, a group of students gathers around a patient's bed. The senior physician asks gentle questions. What do you observe? What are the symptoms? What is the cause? It is the same scene that unfolded in the wards of Al-Muqtadari Hospital nearly 1,000 years ago. If those Baghdad physicians could walk among us now, through sterile hallways and digital monitors, they would recognize the spirit, if not the tools. They would see their own reflections in the young doctors taking notes, in the careful organization of wards, in the compassion offered to the weak. They might even smile. Because the dream that built the Bimaristan was never meant for one place or one faith. It was a human dream. The dream of curing suffering, of easing pain with science, kindness, and knowledge. Through time, others carried that flame. In the Ottoman Empire, great hospitals rose in Istanbul and Edirne, patterned after their Abbasid ancestors. In Persia and India, Mughal rulers built magnificent Dar al-Shifas, houses of healing, where music and water still played for patients' recovery. Even in the far reaches of Spain, the echoes of Cordoba's Bimaristans lingered long after the fall of Al-Andalus. And then, in the 19th century, Europe began to rediscover these forgotten origins. Historians traced the roots of their hospitals, their textbooks, and their instruments back to Baghdad and Damascus. They found the Arabic marginal notes in Latin manuscripts, the invisible fingerprints of the East. It was a humbling realization that modern medicine was not born in isolation, but woven from many civilizations, each one passing its knowledge to the next, like a torch carried across time. The Baghdad bimaristans were the bridge between ancient Greece and the modern world. Without them, the wisdom of Hippocrates and Galen might have vanished into dust. Instead, it survived, enriched and expanded, made humane by the physicians of Islam. And yet, for centuries, their names were forgotten. Their marble courtyards crumbled. Their fountains dried. Only the philosophy remained, pulsing quietly through every syringe, every ward, every patient chart. Listen closely. Can you hear it? It's in the way a nurse reassures a frightened child. In the silence of a doctor's concentration. In the hush of an operating room before the first incision. That same reverence, for life, for healing, that once filled the halls of Baghdad. So much of our world today, from vaccines to mental health care, stands on the shoulders of that forgotten hospital by the Tigris. But perhaps its greatest gift was not a technique, nor a discovery, but an idea. That healing must be both scientific and human. And as our modern hospitals grow ever more complex, with machines that listen to hearts and algorithms that predict disease, we might do well to remember those first healers, who sat beside the sick and listened, not only to the body but to the soul. Their legacy lives not in stone, but in kindness. And that, perhaps, is immortality. The final part of our journey awaits. A quiet reflection at the edge of time, where the story of the bimaristan fades into stillness, and the listener is invited to breathe and rest in its calm wisdom. Now the lamps are dim, and the story, like a patient drifting into sleep, comes to its quiet close. We have walked through centuries, from the marble corridors of Baghdad to the bright sterile light of modern hospitals, and still, that single pulse of compassion beats beneath it all. Take a slow, deep breath. In through the nose, and out through the mouth. Let the weight of time rest softly on your shoulders, like a shawl woven from history itself. Imagine the scent of old parchment, faintly sweet, lingering in the air. The hush of the Tigris at dusk. The ripple of water in a fountain that once stood at the heart of a bimaristan. 1,000 years ago, those waters reflected the faces of men and women who believed that medicine was not merely a craft, but a sacred trust. They moved gently between beds, robes brushing the tiled floors, their hands steady, their voices calm. They carried not only instruments but comfort. Somewhere, in that same ancient light, a physician named Al-Razi examined his patients with careful eyes. He spoke to them softly, asking not only where it hurts but how it feels. Nearby, a young student wrote down every word, the candlelight trembling over the parchment. And in that moment what was created was more than medicine. It was empathy made visible. Now listen. The sound of the city has faded. The merchants have gone home. The call to prayer drifts over the rooftops, a quiet echo through the alleys. Inside the bimaristan, the lamps burn low, and the music of the oud hums gently from the garden. A patient sleeps beneath a woolen blanket. The night wind moves through the arches, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and dust. And the healer sits awake, watching, writing, thinking. What causes illness? What brings recovery? What makes the spirit whole again? Questions as old as time, and yet still unanswered. Now, as centuries pass, that healer's questions travel with us. Through the fall of Baghdad, through the rebuilding of cities, through the spread of science, the rise of laboratories, the hum of electricity, through the invention of microscopes and vaccines and digital scans. And still, the essence remains. Healing begins when one human being chooses to care for another. Take another breath. Slowly, gently. You can almost feel the cool marble under your feet. The distant murmur of fountains. The warmth of oil lamps glowing in the night. Let yourself drift through that place. A place not bound by time. Where the doctors of Baghdad still walk. Their shadows long and quiet across the courtyard. Their voices murmuring lessons to students who lean forward, listening. Observe. Record. Treat with wisdom. Comfort with kindness. The world beyond may have changed. But inside the heart of medicine, their words still live. Even now, when a modern nurse adjusts a patient's pillow, when a doctor places a gentle hand on a trembling shoulder, that ancient oath is renewed. The oath first whispered beside the fountains of a Baghdad bimaristan. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all. Not the buildings, not the manuscripts, not even the scientific discoveries, but the simple human belief that every life deserves care. Let the image fade slowly. The courtyards dissolve into mist. The sound of water fades into the steady rhythm of your breathing. Now you are back in your own time, yet somehow still carrying a little of that old serenity within you. Take one last deep breath in, and release it slowly. Feel your shoulders loosen. Feel your mind quiet. The world outside may be loud and hurried, but here in this moment, you stand within the echo of something eternal. Medicine at its heart is not about the body alone. It is about listening deeply, as those ancient physicians once did, to the voice of suffering, and to the silence that follows healing. And as you close your eyes, imagine that gentle sound once more. The ripple of water in the courtyard of the first hospital. The pages of a physician's notes turning softly in the wind. The murmured prayer for the health of all who suffer. That was the sound of Baghdad's bimaristan. That was the sound of hope. And somehow, across centuries, still whispers to us. So now let your breath grow steady. Let your thoughts drift away like petals on the river. You have walked through time, through dust and light, through fire and silence, and found that the truest medicine is not written in books, but carried in the human heart. Sleep now or rest if you wish. Let the story fade gently like the last glow of an oil lamp, because history, like healing, never truly ends. It only pauses, until someone listens again.